Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they trace the history of the American presidency.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking closely at George Washington, America's first president. We've got this stack of sources here, research, notes, articles, and, well, our mission is to unpack them, to get beyond the usual stories, find the really key insights into Washington, the man, and his presidency. It's an exploration of a complex figure, contradictory even, not just some marble statue. And we'll guide you through the material in our conversation today.
Absolutely. And I think the place to start really is his background. How did Washington's early life shape the leader he eventually became?
Okay, so how did that early life set the stage?
Well, he was born in 1732 into Virginia's planter class, which of course meant a slaveholding society. So inheriting land and, crucially, enslaved people was part of his world from a very young age. His father died when he was only 11. He inherited Ferry Farm and 10 enslaved individuals then. So right away, he's embedded in this system based on forced labor. He's learning to manage property, manage people.
So that leadership experience starts really early.
Yeah.
Within that specific system. What about his education? Was it formal?
Not really a university degree, more practical. Things like math, surveying. But one thing the sources mention is him copying out the rules of civility and decent behavior. It's this list of like 110 rules about self-control, manners, how to present yourself, really about cultivating a public image, skills that were vital in that gentry society and later in politics.
That focus on image, that seems quite important. And his surveying work.
Yeah, he started as a teenager. It's really formative, gave him direct knowledge of the Western lands, And that fueled a lifelong interest in acquiring land, speculating on it. Very common for the Virginia elite. It influenced his thinking on westward expansion later on. Plus, it honed practical skills, organization, administration, really useful stuff.
And then came the military experience, the French and Indian War.
Right. A very harsh proving ground, that war. He had early setbacks. Fort Necessity is the famous one, a defeat. But those failures taught him, critical lessons. Command, logistics, the difficulty of getting colonies to work together. He served under British officers, built a reputation for being brave, capable.
But there was some personal friction there too, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The sources really highlight his deep resentment about not getting a regular commission in the British Army. Despite his service, he felt he didn't get the status he deserved. And that probably, it likely fueled his sensitivity about honor, about respect, maybe subtly shaped his later stand against Britain.
Before the revolution kicked off, he was also in the Virginia House of Burgesses. What was that experience like for him?
He was there for about 15 years. It was like an apprenticeship in how government worked. He wasn't a great speaker, apparently, but he was diligent, worked hard on committees, learned the nuts and bolts of colonial politics. That's where he worked alongside figures like Patrick Henry, Jefferson. And he got involved in resisting British policies, signed those non-importation agreements.
So he had real political experience, not just military.
Exactly. You could see his ambition, but it was always paired with this careful sense of propriety, that image cultivation we mentioned, influenced by those rules of civility. It let him pursue influence through public service in a way that fit with Republican ideals. It built trust.
Okay, that paints a picture of the man himself. Now, let's turn to the nation he inherited in 1789. What was the situation? What was the state of the U.S. then?
Inherited is the right word. The nation was incredibly fragile, teetering, really. The sources point to a severe economic depression after the war. GDP per capita had plummeted, maybe nearly 30% between 74 and 89. And the debt was just staggering, about $54 million federal debt, plus states owed another $25 million. Huge sums for the time.
And the money itself was basically worthless.
Yeah, the continental currency completely defunct. You know the saying, not worth a continental? That's from this period. There was no stable national currency, no banking system to speak of. It choked off trade, recovery, just a mess.
Which really highlights the problems with the Articles of Confederation.
Exactly. The Articles had created a very weak central government that was intentional, a reaction against British control. But it turned out to be disastrously weak. The government couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce effectively between the states, couldn't really enforce its own laws. Washington himself called it limping and half-starved. States were acting almost like separate countries.
And that weakness wasn't just theoretical. It led to things like Shays' Rebellion.
Shays' Rebellion, yes. 1786-87. Indebted farmers rising up in Massachusetts. And the national government just couldn't respond effectively, couldn't raise troops, couldn't raise money quickly. It starkly showed the system's failure. That was a huge wake-up call, a major push towards needing a stronger government, which led to the Constitutional Convention.
Right, the convention. And there was a lot of anxiety there about creating a powerful president, wasn't there? Fear of monarchy.
Oh, definitely. Deep suspicion of anything that looked like a king. But the widespread trust in Washington personally, that was key. Here's the man who gave up his army, right? Voluntarily.
Yeah.
That eased a lot of fears. Sources suggest the presidency was shaped in part knowing Washington would be the first one, made a stronger executive seem less dangerous.
And his election itself was, well, unique.
Truly unique, unanimous. 1789, the Electoral College gave him all 69 votes. Nobody else has ever managed that. Overt campaigning was frowned upon then. His reputation alone made him the obvious, maybe the only choice to unite the states and get the new government off the ground. John Adams became vice president, got the second most votes. But even that apparent unity, well, it hid some deep divisions that would pop up very quickly.
So Washington steps into this incredibly difficult role. How did he actually go about building the presidency, shaping the office itself?
He knew he was on new ground. He said himself he was walking on untrodden ground.
Huh.
So his main focus was setting precedents. He knew everything he did would shape the office for the future. You see that in his first inaugural address in '89, emphasizing unity, constitutional limits, trying to reassure people. His second inaugural in '93 was super brief, really just reaffirming his sense of duty.
And establishing federal authority was clearly a top priority for him.
Yes, absolutely. States' rights feelings were very strong, but he believed a strong national government led by a capable executive was essential for survival, for stability. That belief really drove policies like his response to the Whiskey Rebellion, showing the federal government could enforce its laws.
The international scene was tricky, too, with the French Revolution and wars in Europe.
Extremely tricky. Britain and France at war, again, posed a huge risk to the young U.S. So Washington's main foreign policy idea was neutrality. He felt that the country just had to stay out of European fights, protect its independence, let the economy grow. That led to the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793.
And later, in his farewell address, he warned against permanent alliances.
Exactly. He advised sticking to temporary alliances for specific emergencies, but avoiding long-term entanglements. Foreign policy should be based purely on America's interests. It wasn't isolationism, exactly. More like pragmatic independence, charting their own course, not getting dragged into Europe's messes.
Beyond the big ideas, he also set practical precedents for how the office works day to day.
Right. He started consulting regularly with his department heads, state, treasury, war, the attorney general. That evolved into the cabinet. It wasn't in the Constitution, but it became standard practice. He also firmly established that the president alone could remove executive appointees. Huge for executive control. And he used the veto power, but sparingly. Only twice. But he made the point that the president could block laws he thought were unconstitutional.
Even the title, Mr. President, that was a conscious choice, too.
A very deliberate choice. Meant to sound Republican, not monarchical, like Your Excellency or something. He tried to balance the dignity the office needed with being approachable in a republic, managed public access, entertaining, that sort of thing. But even those efforts, his formality, sometimes drew fire from critics worried about, well, monarchical creep.
Okay, let's pivot to the major policies of his administration. The financial mess was urgent. Hamilton's plan seems key there.
Hamilton's financial program was ambitious and foundational. Its goal was basically to fix the nation's credit and strengthen the federal government. A huge piece was the federal government assuming the states' war debts. This was incredibly controversial. Why? Well, some states had paid off a lot of their debt already. They didn't want to bail out states that hadn't. Plus, critics screamed it would just enrich speculators who'd bought up the debt cheap.
But there was a deal made, wasn't there? A compromise.
Yes, the famous compromise. Jefferson and Madison agreed to get Southern votes for Assumption. In return, Hamilton agreed to support locating the permanent national capital on the Potomac River, hence Washington, D.C. So, Assumption passed. It did work in establishing federal credit and attracting investment, but boy did it deepen the splits. Sectional splits, partisan splits. The fight between Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans really heated up over this.
And the first bank in the United States, another big fight.
Another huge flashpoint. It sparked the first major debate about how to interpret the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison argued for strict construction. If the Constitution doesn't explicitly say Congress can create a bank, they can't. Hamilton argued for implied powers. Using the necessary and proper clause, he said the bank was a reasonable means to carry out Congress's listed powers, like taxing and regulating currency. Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton. He thought the bank was vital for managing finances and signed the bill.
And that constitutional argument just fueled the partisan fire even more.
Absolutely. The bank became this symbol of the divide. Federalists, strong central government, commerce, Jeffersonians, states' rights, agrarian society. Hamilton also pushed for protective tariffs, subsidies for manufacturing, trying to build up American industry. Jeffersonians hated that, wanted the focus on agriculture. Though it's worth noting, Hamilton's economic vision was partly aimed at shifting the economy away from reliance on exports produced by enslaved labor.
Then there was the Whiskey Rebellion, sparked by one of Hamilton's taxes.
Right, the excise tax on distilled spirits. It was meant to raise revenue to pay the debt, but it hit Western farmers really hard. Whiskey was easier to transport than grain, sometimes used like currency on the frontier. Protests started, escalated to violence in Western Pennsylvania by 1794. Washington saw it as a direct threat to federal authority. Urged on by Hamilton, he responded forcefully. Called up militias from several states, nearly 13,000 troops. He even briefly rode out with them himself.
Wow, a significant display of federal muscle.
It absolutely was. A clear message. The federal government would enforce its laws. The rebellion just melted away when the army arrived. It showed federal resolve. But critics, of course, slammed it as government overreach, using the military against citizens. Tyrannical, they called it. Washington did pardon the few convicted individuals later.
Foreign policy kept being a minefield, with those European wars raging.
Navigating between Britain and France was incredibly difficult. The Neutrality Proclamation in '93 was already controversial. Federalists mostly backed it. Jeffersonians felt it betrayed the alliance with France from the Revolution, and they were more sympathetic to the French revolutionaries ideologically. It was Washington asserting presidential control over foreign policy, but it really split the cabinet and the country.
And the Jay Treaty with Britain that caused a huge uproar domestically.
Yeah, tensions with Britain were still high. They hadn't left their forts in the West. They were seizing American ships trading with France, forcing American sailors into the British Navy impressment. John Jay was sent to London, basically, to avoid war. The treaty he came back with, well, it got the British to leave the forts, finally, and some compensation for seized ships. But in return, the U.S. gave Britain favorable trade status, agreed to deal with old pre-war debts, and critically, it did nothing about impressment or protecting neutral trading rights.
So back home, people were furious.
Furious is putting it mildly. Republicans attacked it relentlessly as a betrayal, a sellout to Britain. There were protests, Jay was burned in effigy. Washington, though, believed it was necessary. Better than war with Britain, which the U.S. couldn't afford. He signed it. Then came a fight in the House over funding it. That led to a major constitutional moment where Washington claimed executive privilege, refusing to hand over treaty negotiation documents. The House eventually funded it, but the whole affair badly damaged relations with France, leading to the quasi-war later, and just threw gasoline on the partisan fires at home.
But not all foreign policy was fraud. There was a success with Spain, right?
Yeah.
Pinckney's Treaty.
Yes, that was a definite win. Pinckney's Treaty, 1795, negotiated by Thomas Pinckney. Spain got worried after the U.S. and Britain signed the Jay Treaty, so they became more willing to deal. The treaty settled border disputes, set the Florida border at the 31st parallel. Crucially, it guaranteed Americans free navigation of the Mississippi River and the right of deposit at New Orleans, meaning U.S. goods could be stored there tax-free for export. This was incredibly popular, especially out west and in the South. Huge boost for trade and expansion. And politically, a nice win for the Federalists.
Let's shift focus a bit to Washington's policies regarding Native American nations. The sources suggest this is another complex, difficult area.
Very complex and ultimately tragic for Native Americans. Washington spoke about wanting justice and humanity. He initially envisioned acquiring land through formal treaties, but the reality on the ground, it was just relentless pressure from settlers, from land speculators moving west. And often, the federal response involved military force, leading to dispossession.
So treaties were signed, but they were often part of this larger ongoing process.
Exactly. Treaties like the Treaty of New York with the Creek, or the Treaty of Greenville after the conflict in the Ohio Valley, they usually involved Native nations ceding huge tracts of land in return for peace, maybe some money, annuities. But the promises made in those treaties, frequently broken. Washington asserted the federal government's authority in making treaties, but the government proved unable, or maybe unwilling, to stop settlers from violating those same treaty boundaries.
And there was this policy of trying to civilize Native Americans.
Yes, that was a key part of the administration's approach. Encouraging Native Americans to give up hunting in traditional ways, adopt settled farming, own private property, become, as the phrase went, herdsmen and cultivators.
Yeah.
Now, this was often framed as benevolent, as helping them adapt, but it also directly undermined indigenous cultures, their land use patterns, their communal societies, and conveniently, it made more land seem available for white settlement.
And military force was definitely used when diplomacy didn't work or when there was resistance.
Absolutely. Early military campaigns in the Ohio Valley actually suffered major defeats under Harmer and St. Clair. This led Washington to push for a stronger, more professional federal army, the Legion of the United States. Under General Anthony Wayne, this new army won a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. That crushed the native Confederacy there and led directly to the Treaty of Greenville, where they ceded most of what's now Ohio. Washington himself seemed frustrated by the uncontrolled settlement. He wrote about how scarcely anything short of a Chinese wall will restrain land jobbers, unquote, the speculators. But his administration's actions often ended up facilitating that expansion.
And the overall result for Native Americans was devastating.
Catastrophic is probably the right word. Massive loss of land, erosion of their sovereignty, disruption of their entire way of life, constant conflict. Federal policy, whatever the stated intentions, effectively legitimized this expansion, often backed by force.
Beyond these big policy areas, Washington also had the practical job of just building the government machinery, the court system, for instance.
Right, setting up the actual structure. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was fundamental. It created the Supreme Court, the circuit and district courts, established the Attorney General's office. Washington was very careful about appointing judges. He focused on qualifications, public standing. John Jay was his pick for the first Chief Justice. These early courts started the long process of defining what federal judicial power actually meant, establishing their independence.
And the cabinet, you mentioned that earlier. It wasn't explicitly laid out in the Constitution.
No, it evolved out of practice. Washington started consulting his department heads, Jefferson at State, Hamilton at Treasury, Knox at War, Randolph as Attorney General, and his first cabinet famously included Jefferson and Hamilton, men with fundamentally opposing views on the country's future. Their clashes, right there inside the administration, really fueled the rise of the first political parties, the Federalists and Republicans. But Washington insisted they owed their loyalty to him as president, set a key precedent. The cabinet quickly became this vital, though informal, advisory body.
So these institutions he helped create immediately became arenas for conflict over the nation's direction.
Exactly right. The executive branch under Washington was trying to establish its authority. Congress was debating, pushing back. The courts were just beginning to find their footing. It was all happening at once.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper now into some of the major controversies, the contradictions surrounding Washington himself that the sources bring up. There's one huge paradox right at the heart of it all.
Yes, the inescapable contradiction. George Washington and slavery. He was born into it, lived his whole life as an enslaver. Mount Vernon, his wealth, his lifestyle, it all depended entirely on the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people. The sources give numbers. At his death, 317 enslaved people lived at Mount Vernon. Only 123 were legally his property. 153 were dower slaves belonging to Martha's first husband's estate. He couldn't legally free them. And another 41 were rented from neighbors.
And the sources describe him as quite a meticulous manager of this forced labor system.
Meticulous, demanding, yes. He managed his plantation closely. Now, contemporary accounts vary a bit. Some suggest maybe he provided better food or clothing than some neighbors, but others underscore the inherent brutality of the system itself and his active role in it, including pursuing people who tried to escape bondage.
Did his personal views on slavery evolve at all?
Privately, yes, especially after the Revolution. Influenced by the ideals of liberty, maybe by conversations with people like Lafayette, he expressed unease. Wrote about wishing for gradual abolition done by legislatures. Slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees, was his phrase. He resolved, mostly, not to buy or sell enslaved people, though he made exceptions.
But there's a huge gap between those private thoughts and his public actions, or lack thereof.
A stark, undeniable gap. Despite private reservations, he took almost no public steps against slavery. In fact, he used the power of his office to enforce the system. The pursuit of Ona Judge, who escaped from the president's house in Philadelphia in 1796, is a well-documented example. He actively tried to get her back. Why the silence publicly? Fear. Fear of splitting the Union. He knew confronting slavery head-on would likely break the country apart, alienate the South. National unity, as he saw it, came first.
His will did make provisions for the people he personally owned.
It did. He directed that the 123 enslaved people he legally owned be freed, but only after his wife Martha's death. He also provided for the care of the elderly or infirm among them, and for education or training for the younger ones. But again, this only applied to his slaves, not the dour slaves who were the majority. This meant families were inevitably torn apart. Martha actually freed his slaves earlier in 1801, possibly because she feared unrest among them, knowing they were waiting for her death.
Those numbers really highlight the limitation. 123 freed out of over 300 people enslaved on his property.
Exactly. The sources frame this as a kind of devil's bargain. Washington and many founders chose national unity and stability, as they defined it, over challenging slavery's fundamental injustice. And in doing so, they helped entrench it deeper into the nation's fabric.
Moving on from slavery, though related in terms of power, Washington also very deliberately shaped the executive office itself.
Yes, he firmly believed the country needed an energetic executive, strong, capable to govern effectively and gain respect internationally. Where the Constitution was vague, he consciously set precedents.
So what were some of the most important precedents he established for presidential power?
Well, we mentioned the cabinet creating that advisory body, asserting the president's sole power to remove executive branch officials, claiming executive privilege, like during the Jay Treaty fight, to withhold information from Congress, taking the lead in foreign policy, the Neutrality Proclamation, treaty negotiations, using federal military force domestically, as in the Whiskey Rebellion, and, very significantly, the two-term tradition, stepping down after 2 terms.
Which wasn't legally required back then.
Not at all. It was a norm he established purely by his choice to retire. Later became the 22nd Amendment, of course. It partly stemmed from his own desire to retire to Mount Vernon, but also showed sensitivity to those Republican fears about one person holding power for too long.
But these moves to strengthen the presidency didn't go unchallenged. He faced criticism.
Oh, constantly. Accusations that he was acting like a king, aiming for monarchy. These were common political attacks from his opponents. His somewhat formal, reserved style didn't help. Hamilton's financial plans were seen by critics as creating a kind of moneyed aristocracy. His handling of foreign policy, bypassing Congress sometimes, drew fire. Critics like Thomas Paine, others writing under pseudonyms, attacked what they saw as his high-handed ways.
And the sources suggest these monarchy accusations were often political weapons, playing on fears left over from the Revolution.
Precisely. The fear of tyranny was very real. So while precedents like the cabinet emerged from practical necessity, the criticism shows that tension. Establishing a strong executive in a republic that was deeply suspicious of centralized power. And the fact that many of these precedents stuck was partly down to the immense personal trust people had in Washington himself.
He's often called the indispensable man, the Cincinnatus figure, leaving his plow for duty, then returning.
That image was incredibly powerful and carefully cultivated. His resignation as military commander in 1783 was huge. Then retiring from the presidency after 2 terms, when many assumed he could be president for life. It reinforced this narrative of the virtuous Republican leader, motivated by duty, not personal power. Absolutely crucial in a nation terrified of dictators.
But the sources also suggest there was real ambition there, too.
Yes. Underneath the reluctance, there was definitely ambition. A strong desire for distinction, for honor, going way back to his youth. His careful attention to his public image, his sensitivity to any criticism, it suggests a very calculated approach. Expressing reluctance was also, frankly, politically smart in that era. Overt ambition was viewed with suspicion.
So that reluctant leader idea is more complicated than just pure selflessness.
Much more complicated. Probably a mix of genuine weariness and desire for private life, but also a profound sense of duty, maybe even a sense that he was uniquely positioned to hold the country together. His character is full of these contradictions. The champion of liberty who enslaved people, the advocate for unity who presided over bitter factionalism, the virtuous Republican who faced accusations of favoritism. He likely was genuinely indispensable in 1789 for getting the nation launched. But that very indispensability perhaps made it harder for contemporaries and even for us to scrutinize him critically. It certainly helped build the myth.
Which brings us neatly to this idea of the marble man. How does that almost godlike image compared to the historical reality we've been discussing?
Yeah, the marble man. Cold, flawless, remote. It's far more myth than reality. It was largely constructed after his death.
And early biographers played a big role in that construction.
A huge role, especially Mason Locke Weems, Parson Weems.
Yeah.
His biography came out right after Washington died. It wasn't really aiming for historical accuracy. It was about creating a moral role model for Americans. So he embellished, sometimes just outright fabricated stories. The cherry tree incident, I cannot tell a lie. Pure Weems, no evidence for it. Same with the story of Washington kneeling in prayer in the snow at Valley Forge. Powerful images, but likely fiction.
And the wooden teeth myth, where did that come from?
Also not true. He had terrible dental problems, yes. Wore multiple sets of dentures throughout his life. But they were made from things like hippopotamus ivory, gold, lead, even human and animal teeth, not wood. Maybe the ivory got stained over time, looked wood-grainy. That's one theory. And another common misconception, he never lived in the White House. The capital was New York, then Philadelphia during his terms. John Adams was the first president to live there.
So this idealized marble man image, it served a purpose, didn't it?
It did, particularly in the 19th century as the nation grew and faced crises like the Civil War. This image of Washington as a perfect unifying symbol of patriotism and virtue helped hold the national identity together. Neoclassical art reinforced that statues looking like Roman gods.
How has historical scholarship over the years changed this picture?
Well, early accounts were overwhelmingly celebratory, almost hagiography. Modern scholarship, especially in the last 50 years or so, is very different. Historians now use much stricter methods, a far wider range of sources, his own detailed records, yes, but also archaeology at Mount Vernon, financial accounts, diaries of contemporaries, and, critically, records and perspectives related to the enslaved population. This modern work really deconstructs the myth. It shows us a Washington who was ambitious, politically savvy, deeply conflicted, and very much a product of his time, including its deep flaws regarding slavery and Native Americans. There's much more willingness now to confront the uncomfortable truths.
So it's this constant interplay between the myth created for nation building and the complex reality uncovered by historians.
Exactly. Myths serve a purpose, creating simple, powerful narratives about origins. But understanding the actual history requires moving beyond them. Deconstructing the myth isn't about diminishing Washington's importance. It's about getting a more accurate understanding of the man, his times, and the very complex, often contradictory, nature of the nation's founding. The fact that the myths persist shows how powerful selective memory and idealization are in shaping identity. Rigorous history is the antidote.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from his early life in Virginia, through the immense challenges of establishing a new nation and government, the key policies, the deep controversies like slavery, and finally the myths versus the historical figure. It's clear Washington's legacy is incredibly significant, but also deeply complex.
Absolutely. And unpacking that legacy forces us to confront those paradoxes you mentioned: liberty alongside slavery, unity alongside intense division, high ideals clashing with brutal realities. These weren't side issues. They were central to the American founding.
And confronting them, even when it's uncomfortable, seems vital.
It's essential for any mature understanding of U.S. history, I think. We have to acknowledge the moral compromises, understand their impact, particularly on marginalized groups, to honestly assess the past, and frankly, to understand present-day challenges that still echo those founding conflicts. Just sticking to the comfortable myths doesn't help us do that.
So, in a way, diving deep into Washington really is diving into the nation's own complex DNA. Moving past the marble statue helps us see the real foundation's flaws and all. Thank you for walking us through all these sources.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
And for you, listening, here's something to think about as we wrap up. How do the President Washington set things like executive power, the cabinet, the two-term limit precedents born from the specific needs and the ambiguities of that fragile new nation? How do they continue to shape and perhaps constrain the power and limits of the American presidency even today? Keep exploring, keep questioning.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.